So really appreciate all of the introductions. I think we have a good mix of planning commissioners, electeds, and staff. Some of you have probably seen me give various presentations before, so this one's going to be kind of a sampler platter of all of them, really going into all of the different policy mechanisms that we have to support housing production here in Sonoma County. And the North Bay. Shout out to our Napa folks for being here as well, which I'll talk about a bit as well. So I guess just to get started, I'll give a little bit of a personal introduction, because most of the time when I'm presenting to planning commissions and city councils, I kind of just jump into all the work that Four Leaf does, which is a lot. So I'll get into that as well. But I really just wanted to express sort of, my story, how I came to work in the last 5+ years in Sonoma County in housing policy, and why housing is really important to me, as it is to all of us in this room. I was born in Healdsburg. I was raised in Sebastopol, and my family built a business in Petaluma, so I have multiple hometowns. I really consider Sonoma County to be my home county. Growing up, I had a lot of exposure to people in different housing situations. I was a lifelong renter. My mom was a school teacher. My dad worked in the brewing industry in Petaluma, and so kind of had different perspective on employee housing, teachers that were struggling to afford housing, living in their cars, people who had different incomes at my family's company, just having a lot of people on the couch growing up, different uncles and aunts who were homeless at various times, and just feeling very lucky that we had that home base. Didn't have a lot growing up, but was very lucky to have a rental that was provided to my mom, who worked in education, from former vice principal of LC Allen. And that's what really allowed me to stay in place in Sonoma County and be able to actually return to it. So when I came back to California after working in politics for a number of years on political campaigns, I wasn't expecting that I was going to work in housing. I studied public health. I didn't study planning in college, and I came back to the Bay Area to work for the mayor of San Francisco on the 2019 Affordable Housing Bond, running that field campaign, and that was the moment where I decided I wanted to work on housing 6 years ago. So it was basically that experience, having conversations with San Franciscans about housing issues, and also just trying to find a place to live in Sonoma County and in San Francisco, and going through that kind of musical chairs of just having to, basically find a place to live. And then COVID hit, and it became more apparent than ever that, planning and housing were the issues that I wanted to work on. I was on the Community Advisory Committee for the Downtown Station Area Specific Plan in the potential future downtown resident category. Still have not moved here yet, but great to see the progress across the street, and get involved in that planning process and have a better understanding of what can be done when there are plans that are not too prescriptive and can actually support the kind of development that we want to see. From there, and as I see we're welcoming a Sebastopol council member, perfect timing, as I'm about to talk about, I also joined the Sebastopol Planning Commission, so was able to get involved in planning issues in my hometown, and all of that kind of led me to figure out, okay, what can I do next? And then I actually started working for Generation Housing about 5 years ago, and that was one of my forays to really working in housing policy locally. Did that for a year and had an opportunity to work on housing elements in the 6-cycle housing element planning process. And so for the last 4 years, that's what I've been working on: housing element preparation, implementation, and regional planning work here in Napa and Sonoma counties. So that's kind of my personal introduction. In terms of Four Leaf and the work that we do, as I mentioned, a lot of housing elements. We also staff the Napa Sonoma Planning Collaborative, which provides technical assistance to the 16 jurisdictions in Napa and Sonoma counties through the regional government agency. So there's a program called Regional Early Action Planning, which is state funding that's provided to the regional government organizations and all of the local agencies to provide support, first in getting housing elements adopted and certified, and then from there really moving into the implementation of those housing elements, which is where we are now. I think it was a really successful program on the collaborative, so I want to talk about some of the things that we've done, some of the places that we're going with it. It was really an opportunity for all of our jurisdictions on the staff level to better work together. A lot of, as I've done now after I've written a couple dozen housing elements, it's a lot of the same things. So just getting everybody on the same page, making sure that we're not duplicating efforts and working together to develop regional solutions. I think Sonoma County is generally very collaborative in general. All the staff works very well together. I'm sure those of you who have been council members for a bit have had good experiences working with your planning and housing directors. That's certainly been my experience working with all of them on a daily basis. But being able to bring Napa into the fold as well, and with the already, Napa was very cohesive, Sonoma was very cohesive, and being able to work more as a sub-region helps us understand our housing needs, because as we know, people aren't just commuting within one county. All of our needs and understanding how we can better solve them regionally is really the best way that we can move forward with planning. Just sort of to move back a little bit on Four Leaf and how Four Leaf got involved in the housing and planning space. It started 25 years ago as a building and construction firm, mostly a lot of plan check, construction services, building management. 100% of clients are public agencies. And then the Four Leaf got the contract to do the fire recovery for the Tubbs fire. And since has built the permit recovery centers for a lot of the major mega fires throughout the first California and now the American West. So Malibu, Santa Cruz, Paradise Fire, Maui, Malibu again now, about to go down there next week. So that is a huge part of our work, is really helping people get back in their homes as quickly and efficiently as possible. And so once we started doing that work as a firm, the calls started to come of, okay, you're really good at getting people into their homes quickly. How can we do this beyond fire recovery? How can we make sure that we can improve our planning processes in general? And so Four Leaf brought on Jane Riley, who some of you may have known and worked with from over 30 years working with the County of Sonoma and the cities of Healdsburg and Sebastopol. So I really have just been fortunate the last couple of years to work with her, to work with Jen and all the great people at Gen H, to really bring kind of the solutions-oriented approach from sometimes I think we split hairs, right? Like politics, advocacy, planning. A lot of the time it's just how can we do the best thing that we possibly can and move this forward. So really just looking at solutions-oriented approaches to planning, getting to yes, not getting in our own way, not approaching the job of planning as regulators, but understanding the complex web of regulation on a state and local level to help actually make housing happen. So I mostly work on the advanced planning side. So I guess I'll just start there, for just kind of give an overview of sort of how planning is split up sometimes. Advanced planning is the more long-range stuff, general plans, specific plans, housing elements, which housing element is a section of the general plan, as opposed to current planning, which is more focused on project review, development services. So my team does both. I have people on my team who do staff augmentation, step in as interim directors, interim planners in various jurisdictions, and they mostly focused on the advanced planning side just because there's a lot of work to do there. So that's generally what my focus is, but I'm happy to talk or answer questions to the best of my ability on other planning issues that come up as we're going through this presentation, or we could talk offline about current planning, CEQA, anything along those lines, because it is all very much linked. But just to give that grounding that I'm really more focused on the policy and advanced planning side. So moving into just kind of an overview of what these kind of planning documents are. General plans and specific plans are on the list of some of the things to talk about. My quip that is kind of unhelpful that I usually give, but I just can't seem to move away from it, is that general plans are more general and specific plans are more specific. I know, it's not the greatest, but it's true. General plan is really the master planning document for a jurisdiction, looking at about a 20 to 30 year horizon. Sometimes it goes longer than that. They can sit on the shelf for a long time. It's a very extensive and expensive process to prepare and update a general plan. And specific plans look at more specific areas. PDAs, priority development areas, often are where the specific plans are located. And that's really focused on not just the more specific area, but also action items, implementation for making sure that the development in that specific area can move forward as set forth in that planning document. So that's generally just kind of the overview of general plans and specific plans. There's other pieces of implementation that move forward in the municipal code and specifically the zoning code. There's overlays, there's other policy initiatives that you can use to help support the development of housing, especially if you want to make sure that you're maximizing state laws that have been put into effect. If you're looking to develop housing in a commercial area, but you also want to make sure to continue to support your tax base and have commercial uses. So there's a lot of those complex policy considerations where you can get really creative and innovative in terms of how you can bring more housing into your community while also making sure that all of those other community planning needs are met. So we can continue to talk about that if there are any questions about sort of general plans, specific plans, anything like that in your community relating to housing. If there are pinch points, things like that, I think those are good to consider, sort of ways that You can basically look at those areas where maybe things are being stuck in your general plan, and that can be solved by a specific plan. It could be solved by sort of targeted edits to your zoning code, things along those lines. Yeah, Phil.
So you mentioned like a greater global planning ability, and like one thing is Sebastopol is very small, but it interacts with the western part of the county and Cotati and Guerneville and all these other places. We're super interdependent in our planning. How is this a more countywide plan, or how can we be a part of a greater plan so that we don't feel like we have to absorb certain things and we can make it more mutually helpful?
Yeah, that is a great question. Thank you. So with the general plan, that covers just your specific jurisdiction. So each city has their own general plan, and the county has a general plan as well, but it doesn't affect the incorporated cities. It's really looking at the land use governed within the unincorporated areas exclusively. But to your point that our communities are really interdependent on each other, I think that's where you kind of see everything moving a little bit more toward regional planning considerations with local planning decisions. So that's one of the pieces of the work of the collaborative, is making sure that when there's those issues that implicate other jurisdictions, that there's more of that open line of communication and that those considerations can be made. One good example of that, and one of the areas that, as a region and with our collaborative that we're looking at, is evacuation planning. When you're looking at vehicle miles traveled, transportation planning, if there's a development on one arterial, you can look at it within, your planning area, your jurisdiction, but it might induce demand and create traffic down the road in another jurisdiction, right? So there's all these considerations of, okay, if you add this amount of housing here, you're looking at it kind of within your envelope, but with evacuation planning, like, people are going to have to move between jurisdictions. Same with thinking about, where are people commuting to work? Where are people going to school? All of those things really, show how interdependent we are. And it gets really complex because you only have land use authority, right, over your individual city. I'll mention one plan that I've worked on as well that, kind of has dealt with some of those complexities. I don't think anyone from the city of Cotati or Rohnert Park is here, but if you're, okay. So I can say whatever I want, I guess, about them. But, but I love Cotati and Rohnert Park. I won't say anything bad. But I've been working on project manager for the TOC plan, Transit-Oriented Communities, which I'll get a little bit into, which is really focused on planning around the station areas. The Association of Bay Area Governments has rolled out a new transit-oriented communities policy, which sets forth rules for density, station access, circulation, commercial displacement considerations, making sure that legacy businesses aren't displaced, and ultimately looking at VMT and how it can be reduced by centering housing, commercial development around our transit areas. The thing that was kind of complex about this particular plan is it's really small, but the TOC policy actually covers a half-mile around the transit station. I was working for the city of Cotati on this plan, which is going for adoption on Tuesday. But overall, most of the half-mile area is within the city of Rohnert Park. So that's one of the areas where it's just a lot of communication with that neighboring jurisdiction on, okay, how can we make sure that this is setting you up for success? If we're looking at all of the parcels that are going to be subject to this policy, what kind of densities would, if the city of Cotati exclusively were going to take action, would it be able to be high enough density to offset the thresholds that you'd need to reach as the city of Rohnert Park? Those kind of things. So I think that just thinking regionally and asking those kind of questions when in context of how can we make sure that we're not just thinking within our individual jurisdiction is the most helpful way to move forward with that. I would also just say too, sorry, this is kind of a long-winded response, but they picked up on a lot of good points. The County of Sonoma is in the process of updating their general plan. They're in the first phase now where they're really doing initial community engagement and scoping for the overall general plan, which will be a much more extensive process that's going through this year. So I think that's one way that is really helpful for jurisdictions, even though they're not going to be affected by the county general plan, thinking about how some of those neighboring communities how the cities can inform the unincorporated county as they develop that plan. Yeah.
It's actually just kind of riffing on what you just said. So when, even though I'm from the city, we're actually in a valley, and we have some unincorporated towns we call the Springs, just north. And so with regard to influencing the county plan, where does a local area plan fit in?
Yeah.
I mean, how do we kind of, can we use that as a mechanism to try to influence that whole regional area that includes a city and kind of that corridor?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it comes down to sort of communication and the extent to which a jurisdiction is, open and interested in advocating for certain, aspects of planning. There's some things where, the city of Sonoma might want to say, we have a lot of thoughts about the developmental center and that redevelopment. Maybe we won't say anything. So it's kind of the political will consideration as well of, okay, what would be, what would be most helpful in terms of developing those kind of partnerships? Having a more open and public line of communication on, the kind of, planning actions that you'd like to see. So that's kind of an amorphous answer. Does that answer your question? Or?
It's amorphous.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I understand what you're saying about communication, but when the rubber hits the road, we're writing something into a document.
Yeah.
And so I think what I'm asking you is, in your experience with general plans, what's a reasonably formal way to actually get that mechanism across? Is it kind of working with like the Permit Sonoma to say, we want to define something for this local area? How do we put that in the general plan?
Yeah. Well, the most extreme way would probably just be, annex the Springs. So that's one option. But like walking back from that a little bit, I do think, ultimately working directly with Permit Sonoma is the best way to do that. I mean, every general plan has considerations of the edges too. I mean, that's kind of a big concept in planning is like, there's this kind of idea that, the edges as it gets more rural and then, kind of scales up as you get to the center of the city. Not always true in practice, right? But, just considering the gateways to the city, how that, can make a more connective, kind of demarcated, understanding that you're actually entering a city. In some cities like, Sebastopol, it's more clear because it's very rural surrounding. And then you kind of, you're in town, but it's less clear when you're in Cotati and Rohnert Park, right? You're like, okay, I see that all the streets have the same letter, but like, where am I? What city am I in? So there's all those considerations of like, okay, how do you want it to integrate? How do you want to, separate it in certain ways too? Like it gets very nuanced when it comes down to the policies and programs in a general plan. So again, kind of amorphous, but yeah.
Do you see the general plans being a flexible document, meaning, LA's general plan focus is going to change, just as ours changed in 2017.
Yeah.
And so, and that kind of, for me, ties into like RENA requirements. Things change for just the local pot of money that we have to implement those things in the general plan. Do you see that as being a flexible document, or is it something that's kind of generally rigid?
I think there is some flexibility in there. The general plan is more goal oriented than say a specific plan or other kind of specified policy initiatives that are intended to implement the general plan. So a lot of the time the language it's an interpretive kind of dance that happens of looking at what's listed in the general plan, finding consistency with the general plan for any policy actions that are taken, for developments that are approved or rejected. So I think, looking at, and sometimes it's very conflicting, right? So that's where it's like, it's not so prescriptive to the point where it actually creates these issues and these tensions between, okay, you have two completely opposing general plan policies here that you kind of have to navigate and then think about, that in the context of the community. What's the zoning? There's, I hate to use the term loss of local control because I think that dead horse is beat at this point, but there is somewhat of a loss of local control in terms of streamlining provisions, housing development. If it's zoned for housing, the ability to reject that project is, and I think rightfully so, diminished compared to what it was even just a couple of years ago. And every year, there's more of kind of a statewide or regional approach to planning that oftentimes supersedes the general plan. I think I'll just kind of go back to the point of in theory, the general plan's updated every 20 or 30 years, but in practice, how that general plan is actually implemented changes every year with, record amounts of new state laws that are coming down, with other policy documents that, might supersede or otherwise sort of, shift the interpretation of the general plan. I'll note too with specific plans that they have to be consistent with the general plan, but they don't have to be exactly the same. So that's one way of kind of, making those tweaks, making those pivots, especially as, radical events happen, like major fires, where, a city has to consider how the general plan might be outdated and act very quickly to take actions to get people back in their homes. So I'm going to jump now a little bit into housing elements because I didn't want to go there first because I know like every time we give one of these talks, people are like, oh, we just did our housing element, we're done, we don't want to talk about it for another 8 years. However, that is absolutely not true, because implementation is the most important part of the housing element. It's a really big lift to prepare the document, but at the same time, the implementation is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of actually getting the houses built. So I'll just kind of go over the structure of the documents. Everyone's a little bit different in terms of how they're prepared, but they're all dealing with the same statutory requirements in housing element law. We're now in the 6th housing element cycle, which generally is every 8 years, which is the case for all the North Bay jurisdictions. And the focus a lot of the time is on the regional housing needs allocation arena. It is ultimately a zoning exercise. The state develops a number of homes that need to be zoned for that are then dispersed to the COGs, the councils of government, in this case, which is ABAG MTC, the Association of Area Governments, Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And then the individual jurisdictions have the number of homes that they need to zone for on the basis of income. So that includes default densities for affordable housing, considerations for the realistic capacity of development, whether you're using vacant, non-vacant sites. There's a higher burden of proof for if you've used a site over and over again and nothing's been built on it, to really indicate, sort of what levers are you pulling to make it so that the housing can actually be built this time around. So a lot of the focus gets put on the regional housing needs allocation and the sites inventory, but I'll just note that a lot of where I think the most important actions are in the programs, the housing goals, policies, and programs in your housing element that really provide the roadmap for how you're going to actually make the housing production and preservation happen over the course of the housing element planning period. Because I think we know that housing is increasingly difficult to build based on insurance, interest rates, everything. It's like the kind of macroeconomics are just sort of working against us. So the programs are one area where we can actually have some really tailored action to make sure that it's more possible. I'll also just note from the housing element process this time around, if you weren't involved in the housing element adoption, AFFH, or Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, is a really big deal in this housing element cycle as well. AB 686 was passed in 2019 that codified Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing on a state level. So it was a federal program going back to the 80s that was then repealed in the first term of administration and then reinstated and probably going to be repealed again, but it's codified on the state level, so that's basically every jurisdiction's required plan to make sure that patterns of segregation aren't perpetuated or furthered by the placement of sites on the sites inventory, programs that might concentrate affordable housing development in one area or away from amenities like schools and parks. So that's one of the kind of really integrated pieces that influences both the housing element, but AFFH, it applies to all policy that's done on a local level. So it's not just within the housing element that AFFH is important. If there are, and that's one of the areas where, if a general plan is very outdated and is saying, okay, we have all this multifamily housing and it's like in the floodplain, over here, and it's just never going to get built or whatever because there's just feasibility considerations, tiger, salamander, whatever. Like all of that is now has to be considered in the housing element and can pretty radically change how a city develops and how it can continue to support housing development. As I mentioned, it's not just adoption and certification, but also implementation. But I just really want to highlight, the work of all of the jurisdictions that took the housing element very seriously, especially in Sonoma and Napa counties. We were the first planning collaborative in the Bay Area to have all of our housing elements certified. Sonoma County did it faster than any other county except I think Placer in the 6th cycle. So everybody really came together and got it done, and I was very proud of all of the collaboration on city staff, county staff, to be able to make that happen. In terms of implementation actions, I'll note that housing enforcement is a key part of this housing element. In prior housing elements, it was kind of like you had your list of programs, they didn't have to have very strong commitments. Those days are long gone. It's now, okay, what are you doing? What's your metric for doing it? When are you going to get it done? What's the funding source? Who's responsible? And you have to report on that every year in your annual planning report, or annual progress report rather, sometimes called the annual planning report, APR, which is due every April 1st. Looking at that table of the programs, where your jurisdiction is at, is a good way to understand where you are with your housing element. So the way that enforcement is going to move forward, there's within HCD, the California Department of Housing and Community Development. Kind of surprised it actually took me that long to say that. They're the state agency that reviews and certifies housing elements. It's sometimes a multi-layered review process. And they also now have a housing accountability unit within HCD that's responsible for monitoring and reviewing jurisdictions' effectiveness in implementing their housing elements on both the sites consideration, programs, everything. They have enhanced authority to work with the state attorney general now as well to sue cities or revoke a city's housing element certification. So it's really important that those programs are implemented and that it's done on the time frame that's stated. I'll get to your question in just one sec. That's basically what I wanted to do, just kind of high level on housing elements, but I'll also just note one tool that we have as the Planning Collaborative, which is Housing Connect, which takes the APRs and provides a map of all of the housing sites in both Napa and Sonoma Counties, how they're developing, where they're at in the process, and also provides a place where you can look at all of the programs, click directly through to the housing elements. So that's one tool that helps provide, the list of programs, also the tiers of the programs. So the Housing Accountability Unit is looking at all the programs in a particular order. If you look at your certification letter from your jurisdiction's housing element, HCD says it's very important for you to timely complete all your programs, yada, yada. But this list is the one that's really important. So those are the ones that have to be done first because those are the kind of we're watching you programs, as we call them. And so those are really important. In addition, any that have to do with rezoning, if your jurisdiction had to rezone in order to meet your RENA, and any that have to do with affirmatively furthering fair housing. So there's over 600 programs between the two counties. And so my team now is basically working with all of our jurisdictions to figure out, okay, where are you with these? What can we help you do? If there's any that were due before April 1st, how can we move those to the front of the line and just get that implemented this spring so you don't have to report in your APR. Oops, we haven't done it yet. So that's basically where we are with housing elements and implementation. Yeah.
Yeah, I just, thank you for that. I guess the question I have is, and again, I'll use our city. We are pretty much an infill city. And, a lot of what we have is private property. And the city doesn't have funds to afford to buy it. So at the end of the day, if we're not approaching our RENA, I guess what are the options that we have?
Yeah. So
that we don't get breathed upon by HCD.
Yeah. So I think, I'll start by saying, RENA ultimately is a zoning exercise. As much as jurisdictions, should develop the housing in their RENA over the course of the 8-year cycle, it really comes down to, okay, do you have the zoned capacity? So there aren't any automatic penalties for if a jurisdiction, doesn't develop, all of those units as planned. There are certain penalties in terms of penalties or opportunities, depending on how you look at it, for streamlining. Senate Bill 35 that allows streamlined housing for jurisdictions that aren't meeting their RENA in any of the different income categories allows a developer to go through a streamlined process if there's a site that's already zoned multifamily. So that's one lever, one incentive for developers to be able to help jurisdictions develop the RENA, sometimes called loss of local control, but it's also where you've already zoned your multifamily housing. So kind of two ways of looking at that there. If there's really deficient progress in meeting the RENA, some programs require jurisdictions, depending on what was in the programs and how the housing element was certified. There's some housing elements require jurisdictions to basically look halfway through the period, like, okay, if you're using high reliance on non-vacant sites, or if there's things that aren't quite as tested yet, like there's this new bill, Senate Bill 4, that allows housing on religious institution sites. Some jurisdictions have a lot of church land, and so they're looking at incentives, maybe an overlay zone to provide, just to make it easier to develop on those sites. But if they're non-vacant and they aren't developing within, halfway through the planning period, there are some programs that say, okay, you kind of have to go back to the drawing board and look at, if there's an administrative list of sites that you didn't include to make it a more dynamic inventory. That's one program that we typically include. So basically a list that's kept internally by staff to just be able to add other sites in if there's a net loss of housing. That's one term that you may hear your planners use, no net loss. basically which refers to, if you have a site in your housing element inventory and you say it's going to develop at 40 units, but there's a lower density project that comes in and it's only 15. You've got that net loss of 25 units. Or maybe it's zone mixed use and it comes in as a 100% commercial project. That's also considered net loss. So there's sometimes some shuffling of sites that needs to happen over the planning period if you dip below your RENA. So that's one example of, if everything's just kind of like sitting there and not developing because of interest rates or, things along those lines, it's not an automatic penalty, but there's other considerations at play in terms of sites. Yeah.
I don't know if this situation would ever actually present itself, but you know how you can make agreements in the initial RENA phase with other neighboring cities to shift the numbers around? Would or do you know if there's a pulse on later down the line in the process, once that's all been established, if certain cities have been more successful and maybe even surpassed their RENA allocation numbers, if that can offset the requirements that were initially put upon another neighboring city?
That's a great question. My understanding is that if like within the planning period and after
Yeah.
certification, that's not able to be done because it has to be approved by the ABAG executive committee. I prepared a couple of those RENA swaps, I think all the ones that were done in the county, and so there was like a set time frame for when you could do that. About, I think it was a year within the planning period. But that raises a really good point of sort of the static nature of each jurisdiction getting their own allocation. And it actually doesn't have to be that way. So for the 7th cycle, that's one thing that we're looking into. There's a statutory provision in the housing element law that allows a county or counties to develop a subregion and basically say, okay, here's our RENA, and we're going to figure it out between ourselves. So that would provide more flexibility. It came up and was put in the County of Sonoma's housing element as a program to explore formation of a subregion in the 7th cycle because there was an allocation of 3,881 units in the unincorporated county. Don't ask me why I still remember that number. It's not like I'm bitter about it or anything, but may or may not have helped write the Jen H's appeal letter a couple of years ago, and that's how I met Jane actually, but I digress. So the consideration there is, okay, why almost 4,000 units in the unincorporated county? It's because they look at past development trends, and there was a huge amount of rebuilds from fire. So it's like, it completely boggles the mind that in a place where we're trying to focus on city-centered growth, we're like, okay, we've had all these rebuilds in the unincorporated counties, and Glen Ellyn is a high resource area, and never mind the fact that there's like not that much sewer or capacity for multifamily housing, and there's all these evacuation planning considerations. Like, let's just put it there because that's what the data says. So I think a formation of a subregion is a good opportunity for us to really look at, okay, how can we think about this more logically? Where's the development capacity? Who's actually building? Who has like done a lot in the 6th cycle, and now there's like really limited amount of land. So that's one area where we're looking at that in our succession planning as the collaborative, working with SCTA on that as well. That's a strong priority for them to understand how everything can just make sense, and again, like working across those jurisdictional boundaries to make sort of a regional or sub-regional planning practice that actually makes sense. So that'll be in 2031. We have a little bit of time for that, but we're already starting to think about it. Yeah, come on.
Is RENA compliance measured on AMI levels?
It is, yeah. So there's very low, moderate, and above moderate income. There's certain densities that are required for the lower income level. It's 30 units an acre in Santa Rosa, 20 units an acre everywhere else in Sonoma and Napa counties. And that's because that's what the densities that are generally required to produce affordable housing.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
whether your agency is meeting the housing element and the RENA requirements, and penalties might ensue, SB 35, which changes. Does that matter on the completion of each of the levels?
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so SB 35 is structured such that if you are making adequate progress on just your above moderate RENA, then there's a certain affordability that's required. If you're good on the lower income side, then you're subject at a lower affordability percentage for SB 35. So it's either 10 or 50% depending on the progress that's made. And so the APRs are submitted every March by April 1st. And then the SB 35 determination comes out every year in June. So as of now, I think Most jurisdictions are subject to SB 35 with the exception of, I believe, Sebastopol, Healdsburg, County of Sonoma, and maybe Roeder Park. But again, it changes in June. So, any other questions or thoughts on housing elements before kind of moving into other policy areas? How am I doing on time?
9 minutes officially.
Okay, sounds good. In that case, I'm going to jump into some of the other, kind of implementation-related efforts we're working on through the Planning Collaborative. In addition to just, implementing these 600 programs, we're trying to be as proactive as possible to make sure to implement state law as it comes into effect. 29 minutes. Okay, great.
9:29.
Same thing. I'll talk a little bit slower. So in addition to looking at all of those implementation actions, we're really just looking at ways that we can be as innovative and supportive of housing as possible. I'll just say I think I work all throughout the state on housing plans everywhere from Central Valley, Los Angeles County up here, and something just feels different in the North Bay. You see development in small communities, which you don't often see throughout the state. You see a good amount of development. More is more always, but there's really a different ethos around housing and collaboration and moving forward in a way that actually benefits residents and sports housing. And I think that a lot of that stems from the 2017 fires and the kind of understanding that there was an urgent need to not just get people back in their homes, but also that there's kind of this ongoing seepage of people from our communities. And the only way that we're going to continue to grow and allow our community members to stay here is by producing and preserving housing. So we really look at, the REAP 2.0 goals, Regional Early Action Planning goals, are surrounding fair housing, reducing vehicle miles traveled, and supporting infill development. So most of that is covered within the housing element implementation plan, but we try to be as expansive as possible to make sure that when the 7th cycle rolls around, it's not playing catch up over the last 8 years. It's just building on the work that's already been done. So I mentioned the transit-oriented communities plan a little bit. That's really looking at different densities in the half-mile radius around transit areas. So that's something that's coming up very soon. The default density, as I mentioned, for housing elements was 20 or 30 units an acre. For our Tier 4 TOC areas, which are for SMART, that maximum that's required is 35 units an acre. So there's some jurisdictions that'll be in the position of maybe having to just have to rezone sites for your housing element inventory to at least 20 units an acre to account for that affordable housing part of your RENA, and now that's a little bit higher. So that's something that's coming up soon. It'll be required by early 2026 for jurisdictions to be compliant with the TOC policy. And this one's a little different in the sense that it's not coming from the state. It's allowed by the state, but it's through the regional government. So this is through ABAG MTC. And so it's not technically required by law for jurisdictions to be in compliance with TOC from like a state law perspective. The way that they're incentivizing jurisdictions to adopt these TOC policies is by conditioning ABAG funds, the One Bay Area Grant. These are infrastructure funds that are used for everything from water to sewer, roads, and in our smaller communities, it's about $1 million a year of funding. In larger communities, it's much more. So it's a significant amount of funding. So jurisdictions have a strong incentive to be in compliance with these TOC policies. But there's also a good amount of flexibility on how to do it. So there's existing policy, state law, AB 2097, that eliminates parking minimums, does not allow jurisdictions to mandate parking minimums within a half mile of transit. So that's one of the aspects that's incorporated potentially within TOC plans if that hasn't already been codified on a local level. But ultimately, the densities is the biggest lift in terms of jurisdictions meeting TOC compliance. There's that 25 to 35 units an acre range for residential. And if it's a site that allows commercial, there will be a requirement for at least 1 to 3 FAR, floor area ratio, for commercial sites. So this is required on any vacant land, any commercial sites, and other sites can be opted in. So let's say, for example, going back to the Cotati plan, mostly surrounded by L and M section single family residential. Those existing single family homes are not immediately subject to the 35 units an acre, but they could be rezoned if the city wants to. Yeah, Dan.
Sorry, did you say a mandatory
So if it allows housing, it's 25 to 35 units an acre. If it allows commercial, it's 1 to 3 FAR exclusively for the commercial portion. So there's no FAR for the residential part of TOC.
Okay, but not a mandatory residential component on a commercial.
There is actually so residential is required to be allowed on all the commercial sites,
Okay.
all the vacant sites. Commercial you can choose. So if it already allows commercial, you got to
Right.
include that FAR, but you don't have to allow commercial on sites that are already zoned residential, for example.
And then if you were to build a new commercial, you would need to look at your net because it would result in a net loss, right?
Potentially, yeah. So if you have mixed-use sites in your housing element that are in the TOC area, that's definitely a consideration for, making sure that you can support development. The 25 to 35, it's a minimum. It's a minimum and a minimum maximum. I don't know why I ever say that, but you can go higher if you want to. So that's an option as well. If you opt in other sites, that's another way too that you can offset some of those density considerations. So that's one of the areas where you could actually do an overlay to allow those densities on single-family sites. When you think about single-family density, which is generally like below 10 units an acre, it sounds like a lot to go from 10 to 35. But when you think about a standard 6,000 square foot lot, that's like 3 homes. So it's really not that much. I would just kind of urge everyone, don't be so scared of density and the numbers before kind of thinking about, okay, what does this look like practically? So that's one thing I'll say. Yeah, Mayor.
Yeah, I'm kind of, I don't have a good grip on what 35 per acre really looks like. And at the station, I could see that probably is a low number, but at a half mile away, it's probably a big number.
Mhm.
I mean, if the whole thing were 35, maybe that would seem completely dense. Can you put that in perspective? And you mentioned Katati Station.
Mhm.
There's a development proposed, Centauri, or what was the fronting street to the tracks there?
Mhm.
What is that development proposed at?
Yeah, so I can't remember what the Katati station density is exactly, but if you're familiar with kind of, everything along East Katati, those sort of like 1970s, 1980s apartments that are 2-3 stories, those are pretty much exactly 35 units an acre, sometimes closer to 40. For some, just kind of the other side of things, I think, and Jen might have the number more off the top of her head, but I think the 420 Mendocino development across the street is like 388 units an acre. So there's kind of a big swing that can happen in terms of density. Like there's not, it can change pretty rapidly depending on, the type of units that are in there. You have a way higher number if you have more studios and 1-bedrooms versus, larger units. So there's a lot of considerations with density, and all of the TOC plans, specific plans, can regulate housing more to form as opposed to just density itself through height limits, setbacks, lot coverage, all of those planning considerations that also kind of shape the contours of what density actually looks like in practice.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Have you run across in a higher income area parking problems? Because my thinking is as income goes up, as the expense goes up, it requires more salaries to cover that.
Mhm.
And when we're thinking of density, we're not really thinking of what the income level it takes to support that.
Mhm.
Is that, I mean, have you run into things to where it's become a problem and it's had to be corrected, or it just stays a problem?
That's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of it too is sort of new territory in terms of parking policy. Parking policy on the state level is changing, I would say, more rapidly than any other aspect of planning, from the elimination of parking minimums in transit areas to the TOC policy actually, imposing parking maximums. So there can't be, more than 1.5 units or 1.5 parking spaces per unit. So there's definitely some considerations, especially, in areas where there's already a lack of street parking. What do you do with the street sections to accommodate, more street parking? How do you avoid inducing additional demand by offering things like ride shares or micro mobility options or bike parking, EV charging? There's all these considerations in terms of parking policy. Some may help, some may exacerbate issues. So it's kind of, again, that kind of interpretive dance between, okay, what do we do with the amount of people who live here, the amount of people who are projected to live here, the amount of cars that they're anticipated to have, political sensitivities too. I mean, that's usually the number one thing we hear when there's a rezoning that's going to happen is there's concern around, okay, I don't mind having more neighbors, but, where are people going to park? And so there's all of that too while we're navigating this within a transit system, the SMART that's relatively new. We're I think 6 or 7 years into developing a culture as a community of being train riders, which we weren't before. So how does that change? If we have more people living near stations, or is it that people are still going to have cars and use it to get around every once in a while, going to Giants games, things like that. So I think a lot of it is kind of untested, and these questions are based in the best understanding of planning and how it's worked in other places. But ultimately, I think a lot of it comes down to culture, and are people willing to give up their cars if they live closer to transit? I think it sort of remains to be seen.
It's sort of like, and are developers willing to risk market rate housing with lower parking?
Right, exactly.
It kind of feels kind of crushed our market rate efforts, and it's promoted our affordable housing efforts, but then you got to fund affordable housing. So.
Right, and I think that raises a great point too, that there's, just because there's no parking that's required, ultimately the market is going to decide whether to provide parking in the project. And even in areas where it's not required, is that project going to be able to be financed if there's no parking? Because there's not necessarily that proof of concept that you can have a dense development, maybe in Santa Rosa, downtown Santa Rosa, but it's more difficult to make that case for investors if you're trying to do something like 420 Mendocino in Cotati or Cloverdale. So definitely those considerations.
Do we see that waiving parking requirements on a project that's near a transit station automatically results in people abandoning cars and hopping on the train? I mean, it seems that you may not need your car for around town stuff, but if you work in San Francisco, the concept of not having a car because I live next to the bus, I still got to get to San Francisco.
Yeah.
And I can take the train, and then once I get to Marin, I've got to figure out how to get to the boat because there's no connection there. So are we really seeing that because we built this near transit that people are like, yay, I no longer need a car, or are they with a car and now, boo, I got to find some place to put it?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it sort of remains to be seen, right?
And I find the hardest challenge for our planning commission, for established community members, especially blue ribbon people, is to visualize how it's like to not be that. How can we live differently? NH's event down last year, I said, we'd have a different outcome if homeless people ran the planning commission. We'd have houses being built, and so I find it like to create global change, we need 5% of people to adopt a new method, and we want to build those 5% who will adopt it, put in the car, take the train, and then 5 more will follow. So I think that's what our vision for construction has to be in the future.
I think I find it hard for me, being I couldn't wait to get my license at 16, whereas kids now are like, yeah, maybe. It's a hard transition to understand that for me.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
But to your point, this is why Zipcar was kind of invented, but it hasn't melted up this way. People haven't gotten used to leaving or being a 1-car family instead of a 2-car family because they can use that car share, like what car share was originally meant to get to the long distance. You have your stuff and then your car stuff. So when you maybe plan for these kinds of developments, you might need to incorporate some kind of investment bringing that situation near you.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it is context-based too. There's kind of this move toward eliminating parking minimums because it just provides more flexibility because every project is a bit different, right? So sometimes there's site considerations. If you're building on a really small site, say you're doing 3 townhomes on a single-family home site, we're developing an ADU where you don't have to, if you're doing an internal conversion, where that replacement parking isn't required. So there's kind of those flexibility considerations when it comes to parking policy too. If you're a religious institution that's developing housing on your site, do you really need that whole parking lot that's only used on Sundays? Could that be shared parking for residents? How does it work for mixed use? So I think that's where a lot of sort of the parking minimum maximum conversation is coming from, is painting with a broad brush and, saying that, okay, we're going to have this amount of spaces for, the length of the pew at the church or things like that. When you kind of dig into like all the parking requirements, there comes a point where you're like, okay, does any of this actually make sense? Like, I get that people need parking, I get that people have cars. Everybody's not going to necessarily give up cars overnight, but how can you sort of meet the needs of the residents, of the shoppers, and not be so prescriptive with what you're doing. So I feel like we could talk this whole time about parking if we wanted to. And I know that Paul Fritz is on the agenda, so I'm sure it'll come up very soon.
Paul Fritz and Chris Marnie coming
Yes.
up later. And Adrian, yeah. Lots of parking talk.
That's right. So with that, I'll pivot back a little bit into some of our collaborative products that we're working on for legislative implementation. We started talking about ADUs. That's one that we're making sure that all of our jurisdictions are in compliance with new ADU legislation. There's an ADU handbook that came out about a month ago, the 2025 ADU handbook from HCD. I would highly recommend looking at that because it was pretty outdated at the point that they just rolled this one out. I think the last one that they had done was in 2021. So there's been a good amount of ADU bills that have passed since then. The big change in that handbook is really HCD's interpretation of how many ADUs are allowed on a site. The common knowledge, from the last couple of years, based on HCD's reading of the statute, what was in the last handbook was that you could do one ADU and one JADU, a junior accessory dwelling unit. Your ADU could be attached or detached. The attached one could be new construction or an internal conversion. And that interpretation has changed based on the wording of the law to be, you can now have three. You can have one attached, one detached, and one JADU. So that's a big change. And so as a result of that, I think pretty much out of our 16 jurisdictions, like 15 of them, the code's outdated. So making sure that residents are aware of that, making sure that jurisdictions are aware of that is one of our big lifts now. There's also ADU amnesty. There's a new bill that updated amnesty for unpermitted units. So this was already allowed prior to January 1st of this year, but there's new timeframes and new eligibility around basically the process for being able to formalize a unit that was constructed without the benefit of a permit. So that's one area where making sure that our planning and building divisions within our jurisdictions are working together to understand and code enforcement to make sure that that works in practice is one area that we're working on. As of January 1st, the state also requires every jurisdiction to have pre-approved ADU plans available on their website. So this is one area where we were really lucky to have the Napa Sonoma ADU Center to have advanced a lot of ADU policy that became sort of what was adopted throughout the state and being very ahead of the curve on that. So the Napa Sonoma ADU Center had pre-approved ADU plans for the last couple of years that went through a single plan check and were pre-vetted to be able to be used in various jurisdictions who signed on to it. It's now basically the same requirement. You can still use those plans. It just has to be on the city or county's website. Yeah, here.
And is that a planning approval permit or is that a building approval permit? Those plans?
So they're pre-approved with, if there's certain site conditions that are met, it could basically go straight to a building permit as the process.
How do we actually get access to those? I mean, are they on the website now?
So they're on the Napa Sonoma ADU Center's website. There's a couple of jurisdictions that have updated their websites as well. I know that Katati has it done. Healdsburg has it done. I believe the county does as well. So there's a couple that have done it, and I'm sure there will be more just because it's fresh and more will be on the way. I also just know with ADUs that as of January 1st now, jurisdictions are not required to, but they can opt in to allow the separate sale of ADUs. It's currently allowed that nonprofits and community land trusts can separately sell an ADU, but cities have an option to opt in and allow anyone to sell that ADU. It's a good opportunity to allow accessible housing, to more naturally occurring affordable housing, lower square footages, lower sale prices. So that's something that we're going to be bringing a model ordinance forward to for our jurisdictions who may be interested in that. Yeah.
That would, if there's a deed restriction such as income requirements, that would still follow through with that separate sale?
That's right, yeah. It's not required though under this one. It would be for community land trust or a nonprofit to provide an affordable ADU, but this one could be sold market rate.
Just thinking if you lower fees
Mhm.
for that to be built, that could continue through with that sale.
Yes.
And it has to be updated from a permit point of view.
Sorry, what was that?
You have to combine the previous ordinance you mentioned, or law you mentioned, that it has to be permittable.
Mhm.
You can't sell it if it doesn't have a permit.
Right, exactly.
Recertified as legal.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's certain, I think it's before 2020, the unit has to have been built. So, someone can take advantage of that ADU amnesty law by, just building something without a permit now and getting it legalized. So, no loophole there. There's also ADU, yeah, go for it.
In the same footprint, I mean, that amnesty applies to an ADU that was built before 20.
January 1st, 2020.
And the same footprint, or is it then going to be subject to new setback requirements?
I would have to double check with you on that, I would have to double check, but I can follow up with you on that. Another ADU piece that we're looking at is monitoring. There's certain affordability assumptions that were included in the housing elements as to how affordable the ADUs were based on a survey that was done by ABAG. So that's going to need to be updated, and jurisdictions are going to need to keep track of what ADUs are renting out as, because that's how they're measuring the affordability of those units.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
What jurisdictions have opted in to the separate sale ADU?
Just San Jose that I know of as of now. There might be some smaller ones as well, but San Jose, I believe, was the first. Yeah.
Can I ask you, on the monitoring, is there any, obviously none of the jurisdictions have any authority to demand a resident of an ADU provide what they're paying? Like, we don't have an enforcement mechanism on
Right.
that. How does HC imagine that monitoring taking place at the jurisdiction level for any units that are not under, say, a regulatory agreement?
Yeah, I think it's basically just a voluntary survey. So I think that's the best that can be done, basically.
So I was thinking that Sebastopol could increase its housing with separating ADUs out, like, somebody who's retired could get the income off of flat selling the place. We would be interested in like figuring that out. I don't think we have a policy for it, and how would we make that happen?
Yeah, and so it would be adopted by ordinance, and
But we have like, you guys offer a way to make the ordinance kind of canned?
yes,
packaged?
yeah, we're preparing a sample ordinance for jurisdictions to be able to use. So yeah, happy to continue to work with you and your staff on that. So moving on, as I know we're a little bit short on time now, just we'll go kind of high level through some of the other products, including missing middle housing. That's a term for plexes, townhomes, other small unit developments, gentle density within lower density neighborhoods. There's Senate Bill 684, which allows for up to 10 units to be developed on vacant sites in multifamily areas, and it was amended this last year and will go into effect on July 1st, that you can develop those units on vacant land within single family zones. So again, it's subject to default density, so if you have like that, it's up to 10 units an acre, or it's up to 10 units per parcel to do this small lot subdivision, but it's 20 units an acre or 30 in Santa Rosa, so really looking at about 3 units for a 6,000 square foot parcel. Senate Bill 10 is one option that a jurisdiction can do to provide missing middle housing on select parcels. It's very customizable, up to 10 again, but you can do it at a higher density. You could do it only in TOC areas. You could do it only in non-historic areas. There's a lot of ways that it could be customized to meet a jurisdiction's need and allow for more housing within lower density areas. So that's one. If your jurisdiction's interested in working on that, we're very eager to get someone to bite on SB 10. No one's done it yet, but it's an exciting option, especially when you consider, if you can do 3 units on a parcel, but you could also do, 1 unit and 3 ADUs. At this point, it's like, okay, how can we actually have an incentive for slightly higher density in those Plex style developments?
You can count us.
Excellent. Awesome. Streamlining provisions, I got into this a bit, with religious sites, but we're kind of seeing this, okay, you can develop affordable housing in various ways at default density. There's also Assembly Bill 2295, which is one that I think will be increasingly relevant for our school districts to develop affordable housing that is first offered to educational employees. on any district-owned land. So definitely something, to consider as jurisdictions are working with school districts in the midst of school closures, or schools that have been closed for a long time and are still owned by the district and just sitting there, or a district office that's like in one portable, but it's sitting on 2 acres or whatever, so there's a lot of development opportunity there. And there's a structured, there's basically a structure for who it gets offered to, district employees of neighboring districts, and then it can be open to the general public. So it's less likely to run into some of the issues that educational employee housing has had in the past, where it's very prescriptive in terms of who can live there, and then no one from that institution wants to move in, and so then the units sit vacant. So that's another one to look at as well, 2295. I talked a little bit about overlays, but I think that's just one where, again, you can be really creative on, if you want to incentivize mixed use. There's housing that's allowed on commercial lands now through Assembly Bill 2011 and Senate Bill 6. There's a bunch of requirements around it, and an overlay would be one way to simplify that and actually be able to incentivize providing both commercial and residential housing if you allow more beyond what state law allows. And finally, I'll just note some of our work on the pro-housing designation, because that's one area where we've been very excited to collaborate with Generation Housing and all of our jurisdiction staff on that. We were the first county to have a majority of our jurisdictions designated as pro-housing, and that is primarily important not just for the political clout, but to actually provide access to funds. So there's a direct pot of funds through the pro-housing incentive pilot that only designated jurisdictions have access to. And to date, over $2.3 million has been allocated to Sonoma County jurisdictions as a result of having that pro-housing designation. And it also provides enhanced access to things like the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Grant, which Healdsburg just got. I don't even know the number. It's like $75 million or something from that. So that's one mechanism for jurisdictions to be able to have better access to funds, not just on housing, but also on transportation and infrastructure funds. So we're really looking to have all of our jurisdictions in Napa and Sonoma County be part of that list. So I'll just close by saying thank you very much for the opportunity for me to talk planning, and look forward to having conversations ongoing with all of you. I have a stack of business cards up here. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime if there are things that you want to do in your community to support housing production. And thank you very much to Generation Housing for helping get me into this work, for being such a good partner over the years. I think there's so much opportunity and so much momentum in our communities to harmonize with state policy and really look for opportunities to do more. So thank you all, and yeah, appreciate everything else we can accomplish.